All right, let's jump in here, get going. Lots to cover before Friday, I guess. I can only think that whoever did this was outlining the correct bribe amounts for better grades. I don't know who that was. All right, so last time we were talking about youth and religion, and specifically we got into some of the data from the first wave of the National Study of Youth and Religion, all the way back in 2005, that had to do with life outcomes, right? And kind of generally speaking, well, actually, you can go back and watch it. The video is up on YouTube if you want. But the most religiously engaged, the ones that Smith and Denton call the devoted, had the best life outcomes across all measures. Okay, so I'm going to jump in a second here. I'm going to talk about the 9 cultural factors that Smith and Denton suggest are probably responsible for this. And this is a bit of this is the slide with a lot of things on it. I'll try to move fast through it, but we'll go from there. Before I do that, anyone have any questions you need to ask? I know final is coming up. There's more people here than usual, possibly, to ask questions. I don't know. Or maybe your other coursework is now cleaned up and you can come to class again. But any questions before I jump in?
I'm blanking. What was the operational definition of better life outcome? Like, what is this better life?
So typically speaking here, you're looking at, better quality of there's a bunch of them across. So better quality of relationships with adults, less risk-taking behavior, better grades, right? All of those things that we would tend to think are positive are kind of lumped under, better life outcomes for teenagers. So I'm missing some of them, but I'm doing it without trying to tab back 8 slides. Okay. All right. If we're all feeling okay, let's jump in. All right. So number 1. So basically these are Smith and Denton are sort of theorizing, right? Like, what would be the things that make the devoted different than all those other categories and that would contribute to their better life outcome? And they suggest that it's probably some combination of these 9 things. Now, I will note for the record that really, in some sense, only 3 of them, this one, are explicitly religious, right? So there's a lot of things in here that actually have more just to do with the fact that religious communities are communities, right? And that they offer certain things to people. Now, religion is added on to that, and it's the sort of binding glue around everything that happens in religious communities, right? It is, that kind of faith in superhuman powers, right, is the thing that binds those communities together, and it's why religious communities are different, according to Smith, than other things. So you should be thinking, in a sense, when you hear this, of that definition that he gives, that we talked about at the beginning of the course, right, in terms of what is religion. Well, it's in that kind of, belief in the ability of superhuman powers to change things, that those communities are bound together, right? People go to those communities because they all share this common belief. And that's what makes religious communities different from a lot of other communities, right? Because other communities, your sports club, your political party, the Kiwanis, right? Whatever it happens to be, doesn't share that belief in superhuman powers, right? Okay, so just keep that in mind, right? This is an earlier development from Smith. Like, he wrote this before he wrote his definition of religion. But I think, you can see where some of this is coming from as well. Okay, so the first one, right? Moral order. So, we've talked about this a little bit, right? And we've had some good questions about sort of the moral basis of religion. But basically, in their sort of core assessment, what Smith and Denton suggest is that one of the big differences between kind of the devoted and, the other groups, for the most part, is the fact that the devoted are more likely to adopt what you would probably call either virtue ethics or deontological ethics, right? And basically, versus when you look at those who are in those other categories, especially the disengaged, they're more likely to engage in moral consequentialism, right? Or a moral consequentialist type of ethics. So what does this mean, right? Well, basically it means that when a religious young person, right, when one of those devoted young people looks at any kind of moral problem, they've essentially got, either a set of teachings that tells them exactly what they're supposed to do, or, if you want to talk virtue ethics, in theory, they've developed a series of moral habits which sort of guide them, essentially to whatever decision they're going to make. Now, those decisions, as it happens, according to Smith, are the ones that tend to be most favored by kind of other social actors, right? So if you look at the second kind of bullet point under that American religion promotes specific moral directives of self-control, personal virtue, grounded in long historical narrative traditions, right? A lot of the sort of valued moral traits that American society has are the ones that come out of essentially a kind of Christian tradition, right? And so these people just happen to kind of share those basic moral assumptions. Yeah, please.
Could you argue, if we look back at Tom Holland's theory, that Christianity has kind of permeated a lot of society without us knowing? So could you say that, like, atheists and agnostics say or would lean towards Elon? I cannot talk.
A moral consequentialist.
Moral consequentialism, when actually it is kind of off-brand virtue ethics.
Like the moral consequentialism would be.
Yeah.
It's more that they're going to judge each moral decision ad hoc, essentially, right? Like virtue ethics would sort of assume that, you know what is virtuous and you are sort of building moral character and moral habits towards it. What Smith and Denton suggest more is that and this is what moral consequentialism is that you essentially judge each moral situation based on the consequences, right? So is it going to harm someone else, right? Oh, I talk about this not in this class. I talk about this in youth, and I talk about this in a different class. But for millennials especially, and I think this carries through for Gen Z as well, there is this sort of ad hoc moral decision making that's based on a kind of free-floating notion of do no harm, right? That's unanchored in any kind of philosophical sort of tradition that we can kind of identify. But then it's like, okay, should I cheat on this test? It's not no, cheating is wrong, which would be the sort of deontological or virtue ethics way of looking at it, right? I guess virtue ethics would be cheating would foster a poor moral character and will lead to more bad choices later on. And you certainly would see that in, say, Catholic ethics, for example. And I mean, Jewish and Islamic ethics borrowed from this Aristotelian tradition as well. Whereas, for the moral consequentialist, it's like, well, what's my chance of getting caught? What's the harm it would do to other people? And if it's not so every decision ends up being sort of in the moment, or like that's what ad hoc means, right? And that's sort of what Smith and Denton are suggesting, is that, yeah, every decision, essentially you have to think about every moral decision and kind of put it through this consequentialist sort of lens. Does that make sense? Does that answer your question? Okay, probably you're like, yes, too much, stop talking. It's late in the semester. Okay, what was I saying? Yeah, so both, they're deontological in the sense, or virtue ethical in their kind of orientation, in the sense that, your moral choices are not set by your desires or preferences or what's good for you. They're set by an existing moral code. And that just happens to be the one that sort of permeated through Western society, right? American society values things like honesty, self-control, personal virtue, hard work, all things that end up being sort of things that the devoted also value because of the traditions that they come out of, right? Hard work would be part of a virtue ethics kind of tradition. Okay, so that's moral kind of order, right? They have a moral order that aligns them with the basic values of say, American society. And people are going to perceive them as, hardworking, good people with good values, which is going to give them that social and cultural capital in a lot of cases. Okay, spiritual experiences, right? In this, basically these are experiences that would solidify kind of the moral commitments in number one, right? religious communities, and certainly some are better than others, religious communities are going to offer sort of spiritual experiences through meditation, prayer, worship services, fasting in Ramadan, shared collective experiences, if you want to use Durkheim's term, that collective effervescence, the Seder in Judaism, that are all going to kind of reaffirm those moral beliefs, right? So you're going to, I don't know, if you're, let's say you're a Methodist, right? And like John Wesley, you feel your heart strangely warmed, right? You could interpret that as the Holy Spirit confirming your beliefs as ultimately true, right? So spiritual experience will ultimately strengthen those moral commitments and kind of double down your kind of, virtue ethics or deontological sort of ethics that align you with the culture, according to Smith and Denton. Okay, number 3, I'm trying to go through these fast, role models. Basically religious communities, and I mean, if you remember from last time, one of the things you saw on those charts, and you can go back, is that those religiously devoted young people were more connected to more adult role models, right? There's something like 8.1 versus 5 point something for the disengaged, meaning they have more kind of role models, people who hopefully are living positive lives, right, and are examples for them. Again, so this would be reaffirming in a lot of ways, in this case, of lives shaped by a religious order, right? If they're doing well, they have good families, things look at least good from the outside. They're living positively. I don't know, a sports coach or a youth worker or something, right? This is going to, an imam or a pastor or a rabbi, whatever it happens to be. This again gives them positive role models to follow, right? Outside of just their parents. Okay. Number 4, community and leadership skills. This one is Smith and Denton actually see as really, really important, more important than you might otherwise think. What they suggest is that religious communities, in a lot of cases, offer more opportunities for young people to get involved and take leadership positions than they have in a lot of other circumstances, right? Well, let's say in school, young people often, there's limited kind of opportunities to take a leadership position or a position of prominence in the community, right? But in religious communities, whether it's, helping out with potlucks or, helping out with, it's Christian example, Sunday school or whatever the equivalents are, in other kind of communities, a lot of kind of teenagers and early or emerging adults will be given these kinds of leadership opportunities where they can develop skills, right? Develop skills that then make them confident in organizing, speaking to other adults, right? And being in sort of prominent positions, which, develops things like, which will develop things like cultural capital and social capital, right? Which are both really, really important, right? So you get more opportunities, right? You're in a community that wants you to participate in these things, and that in a lot of cases, right, if we're looking at religious communities, it's sort of desperate for you to participate in these things in some ways. And so, you're organized and oriented to take these kinds of roles. Okay. So again, you're building those skills before you hit adulthood. You can even think of like Malcolm Gladwell's, 10,000 hours kind of thesis. If you're a young person in a religious community and you're given these opportunities to lead, to lead younger children or teenagers, right? You're already developing leadership skills before your peers do, right? So you're putting in your reps in terms of leadership skills at an earlier age, so you have more of it and you're more confident in that when you step into the rest of the world. So again, you can see what I mean when I say a lot of these are not actually religious in any kind of sense, but they just happen to happen a lot in religious communities. Okay, coping skills, again, I say this one is kind of a specifically, I think, more religious one. And here, right, this is like when struggles come, right, and struggles inevitably come to everybody. Religion has, any religion, right, whether you're talking Islam, Buddhism, Christianity, whatever, Judaism, right, they all have systems basically for dealing with hardship, right? So, your loved one dies or you're facing, financial difficulties, right? you can fall back on the traditions of those religions to give you kind of a path forward, right? What do you do when you fall on hard times, right? If someone dies, right? Like, Judaism, for example, has a really, really refined way of getting community members through those first stages of mourning, in the sitting Shiva, right? Where the whole community sort of comes in and sits with the grieving family for 7 days, right? And kind of brings food, gets them through that, and then supports that family as they're moving through that grieving process, right? That's, a good example from Judaism, but every religion has sort of coping strategies for hardship, right? For those moments when life gets really difficult. Again, it's not that, people who are the disengaged or the sporadics or the regulars don't eventually find coping skills. It's just that, again, it's a little bit more ad hoc, right? You have to sort of put it together yourself. So you get, you'll find help in, say, the self-help literature for this kind of thing. But, with a religion, you can just kind of jump right into an existing package of practices that gets you through difficulties. Okay, cultural capital. Again, I think related to number 4 in lots of ways. Cultural capital is essentially being able to present yourself in such a way that other people want to help you, right? That you can motivate people to help you in, achieve your life goals, right? So, social capital can be things like, the ability to speak to adults in particular, if you're talking about young people, to ask them for help, to present yourself in such a way, use language that works, dress in particular ways, know how to approach things, so that people want to help you. And what Smith and Denton suggest is that there's a lot of social capital that's created right here. Cultural capital that's created right here. Because as you practice being a leader, right, as you practice being in the community and taking your role, you're navigating adult relationships. And one really critical thing that Smith and Denton will suggest, and this is true of both 6 and 7, is that increasingly the lives of young people have become segmented in spaces where they're clustered together with people only their own age, right? School in particular, like all the way from kindergarten to, the end of university, you're going to be mostly associating with people who are the same age as you, kind of in a rough range, right? And so, what they suggest is that religious communities are one of the few places left where there's a lot of navigating people of various age groups, right? Where you're, in a community with, kids that are 2 years old and elderly people, right? And you can interact with all of them in this kind of space where you're all unified by something, right? But religions typically are much less age segmented than a lot of the other parts of young people's lives. So they can build that ability to interact with people of various ages. Smith and Denton don't talk about this, but this has been talked about by a psychologist and pediatrician named Leonard Sachs. And he suggested that especially young women gain a lot from these mixed age communities, right? Especially interacting with women of various ages. And I love Sachs that he talks about it, when a 14 or 16 or 18-year-old girl or woman is, thinking, is this guy I'm dating any good? Is this going to turn into a relationship that's good? It's actually incredibly beneficial to have, women in their 20s, 30s, 40s, and 50s being like, no, sister, that guy ain't no good. And you should cut your investment, because a lot of their peers, won't have that same kind of perspective as to, what a good, lasting, solid relationship is, because they themselves haven't necessarily experienced it, right? But someone in their 50s, who's lived a lot of life and seen a lot of things, maybe gone through bad relationships herself, or had friends or sisters or whatever gone through bad relationships, can provide a lot of perspective that's really positive and can help, young people avoid some of the tripping hazards that come along with adult life. Damn it, this slide is so long, 20 minutes. There's a lot here. Okay, so that's cultural capital. Social capital, right? So social capital, think of it this way. This is always, I think, the simplest way to think of social capital. It's not who you know, or no, it's not what you know, it's who you know, right? A lot of getting forward in life, especially getting your start, can be down not so much to your skills as to your connections, right? So any place that you can build connections, especially with older people who might be able to provide you with opportunities, is a really positive thing, right? So if you're, say, I don't know, you're, young Muslim, and you are looking for that first engineering job out of university, right? And there are people at your mosque that are engineers, or they work for engineering firms, or they're connected with people, right? If they can connect you into that, your chance of getting that job is obviously better, right? They can kind of, I'll tell my brother or my cousin or my second cousin or my friend who runs this engineering firm, hey, give me your resume, I'll pass it on to him, and then opportunities can open up that way. Robert Putnam wrote this very, very famous book. He's a sociologist. It's called Bowling Alone. You've probably heard of it throughout your undergrad degree. It's very famous. One of the things with regards to social capital that Putnam says is that between 55 and 60% of social capital in America, and I think he wrote the book in 2010, 55 to 60% of social capital in America is generated in churches, right? They're these very deep, very consistent communities of people who care about and support each other and share common values. And so they're very deep places to build social capital, which gives a lot of benefit to young people as they go forward, right? It gives them opportunity, it gives them support, it gives them mentorship, right? Because you can reach out to people. Okay, the last two, actually, number 8 is super important as well. I was going to say the last two are less important. Number 8 is actually critical. I'm going to put a square around it. Please.
Is it going to be like one of the starred ones that's like religious?
It's not necessarily religious, but it's actually critical in its own way. And I'll explain why. But it's not religious necessarily, because this could happen anywhere. All right, so network closure is this very particular concept that has to do with young people. So what is network closure? Basically, for Smith and Denton, it is the number of... So, okay, think about a young person's life, right? If something is going wrong, there's adults that are probably noticing, right? That something, this kid seems off, they're sadder, or they're hanging out with a bad crowd. I see them in the smoking area behind the high school or whatever, right? Whatever it happens to be, there's adults that notice. How connected are those adults to each other and to the parents, right? So network closure is basically how much of the young person's time is within the purview of adults that are communicating with each other, right? Who will talk to each other and, basically say, little Sheila is seeming, I don't know, maybe she's dating a guy who's bad news, right? Or whatever. Hanging out with a bad crowd. Okay, her coach, right? Also goes to church at the same place as her parents, and maybe her volleyball coach then is like, hey, parent of Sheila, did you know that she's kind of been hanging around with this bad group of kids, right? Or she seems extra depressed lately. Is something going on, right? There's more adults connected to this young person who are communicating with each other, right? And I think, I don't know if I could find it really quickly because I made a big deal out of it. The number of supportive adults parents know well enough to talk to. All right, it's this number, right? This is the one. This is network closure, right? Compared to here, less than half. There's more adults, basically supportive adults, a teen's parent knows well enough to talk to them, right? So to figure out what the puzzle is for that young person's life, like what's going on? How can we help them? Do they need support? There's more of them for those devoted people. Again, they're more densely networked, right? They're networked in these religious communities, and it's more dense. So there's more of those adults. I'm sorry to have tab back. So that's what they mean by network closure, right? Their time is more supervised. They have more supervised time. They have more adults that are communicating with each other about that young person. So if something goes wrong, there's less likelihood that that young person is going to fall through the cracks, right? So that, something bad will happen. They'll go in an antisocial direction. There's more chance the brakes are going to be put on that much earlier with a kind of closed network system. And it's like double, right? It's a little bit more than double the number of adults in those devoted religious communities. So there's more chances that stuff's going to get caught. All right, and then extra community links. This one is probably the least important, I think. But just think of religious communities in the following way, right? They're networked with other religious communities, right? So let's say, a young person wants to join a social service organization, right? There's a whole bunch of, if you're talking Jewish, Christian, Islamic, Hindu, Sikh, right? Each of them have their own service, like social service wings, right? That go out in the community and do good. If you happen to move away, right? Like let's say that you're moving from Edmonton to Toronto, right? There's a good chance that your religious community might have connections to other religious communities. So instead of being sort of cut loose, suddenly living in Toronto with no connections, you could network into that community somewhere else, right? So these communities are all kind of linked together. They are connected to, social service groups, to, groups that help young people, do great things, or other communities that a young person can network into. Okay, that only took me 25 minutes for one slide. I have hope that I can complete this course as I had originally planned. There's a lot here, obviously, right? And I think it's important to talk about. All right. I'm going to go very quickly through some emerging adult data, and then hopefully I can start in on Gen Z, which is probably the last big idea set we're going to talk about, and it's super duper cool. So let's go. Okay, so 5 years on, right? So second wave of the National Study of Youth and Religion looked at the same group of teenagers, right? Now kind of ranging, from about 18 being the youngest into those emerging adult years, the oldest of them sort of in the first or second year post-college. Okay, so broadly speaking, if you lump them together by religious tradition, basically we don't see any kind of better life outcomes per tradition, right? Catholics don't seem to do better than Mormons, or Jews, or mainline Protestants, or evangelicals, right? It's all kind of the same. Why? Well, because there's a lot of variation in religious devotion within each of those traditions, right? You're going to have your super religious Muslims and Catholics and Protestants, and then, people down the kind of marginality chain. Okay, however, like the categories they had before, and they end up using the same categories, the level of dedication plays the largest role in terms of positive life outcomes. So again, I'm going to look at this really quickly. Okay, so the devoted, right, so that most religious category is down to about 5% from 8. The regulars down to 14 from 27. Sporadics way, up very little, but then are the disengaged, up to 25% from about 12. So we've had losses in even our sporadic and better kind of religious categories, our regulars and our devoted, and the sporadic and disengaged are growing. Now that makes sense, right? As they move out of their parents' houses, as they become adults, you do go through this process of differentiation where people pull away from their parents' religious identities and faiths, and they have more say over their lives. Certainly, those who've transitioned from 13 to 18 now have a lot more say in what they do. So, not surprising, and that's where the numbers sit. Okay, according to Smith and Snell, because he's now writing with another one of his students, Patricia Snell, the difference between the groups that we talked about last time are still present to some extent, in the second wave data. All right. So, again, I won't go through this, in huge detail. You see kind of some better outcomes in terms of parental relationships, right? More of them, get along very well with their moms, right? 83 versus 71. Talk to their mom about personal subjects, 35 versus 20. They feel their mother understands them much more, right? Get along with their father. That number's lower. Not a huge difference, 8%, but it's still different. More of them talk with their father about very personal things, about double the percent, and feels their fathers understand them. Again, not great numbers across the board, but kind of there in general. All right, and 76% of them, of the devoted, their parents are still together, as opposed to 51% of the disengaged, right? So they have better quality relationships with their parents. Okay. Their social engagements, they're a little bit more engaged, right? If you want to look just like raw numbers, total number of organized activities they're involved with, they're more out there in the world, about double compared to the disengaged. All right, and I am going through this really, really quickly. Their moral orientation fundamentally hasn't really changed, right? It's still virtue ethics or deontology, though none of them would say that, by the way. If you ask them, they would just not know what I'm talking about, but we can kind of put it down to that, right? So believes it's okay to break moral rules if it works to one's advantage, 4% versus 22. Believes that morals are relative, 16 versus 63. And again, whatever you think about those particular positions, they just orient people in some ways. Yeah, Mia.
But also show a different form of moral reasoning, meaning like there's still like the moral
Consequentialist.
ethics and the moral consequentialist.
Yeah, so I mean, here you're going to, like in the devoted, you're going to still be talking about principally virtue ethics and deontology as the kind of bases. Again, though people would never articulate it that way unless they've taken a philosophy class. And here again, they're basically moral consequentialists as when they're disengaged, right? And that fundamentally hasn't changed, essentially. Yeah, and okay, there's caring about equality, right? So those numbers kind of stand roughly the same. Okay, again, less risk-taking behavior, drink weekly or more. The devoted drink a lot less. They don't binge drink as much. Binge drinking is a particularly nasty behavior. It makes you do all sorts of odd and terrible things, and it's bad, really, really bad for your health. Sorry, I was at a staff Christmas party on Saturday, and some of the grad students were clearly binge drinking, and it was very uncomfortable. I was like, okay, you're going to have to live this down on Monday. But okay, yeah, don't get drunk in front of your potential supervisors. I'm going to put it that way. It does not come off well. Okay. Yeah, percentage of the 5 closest friends who do drugs or drink a lot of alcohol, right? 16 versus 50%. Again, cigarettes, bad for you. They smoke less cigarettes. Marijuana, 0 versus 18. Likes to take risks, not a big difference, but they're below the average for everybody, right? Which means they're going to take less risks and get into less trouble in general. Okay, I have 2 charts on here. Sorry, it's a lot of data, and I just want to give you a sense of it without jumping into it. I don't know, they think they feel healthier, they're more kind of, their BMI is a little bit better. Generally feelings on physical appearance, right? They're happier with their physical appearance, right? Which is important for well-being, less unhappy by more than double. Think about the future. Everybody thinks about the future, but they think about it more. Think about the meaning of life. They think about it a lot more. Rarely or never feel sad or depressed, a 10% gap. I don't know, I could go through all of these and I won't. I'll let you just read the rest of them for yourself. But generally, right, there's a lot of things here that point to people who are a lot kind of mentally healthier, they have better mental health, they have better relationships, they take less risks, they do less things that are going to cause them long-term problems like drinking or taking drugs and all of that stuff. Yeah, life satisfaction. Oh, here's one. The average is 69% of those who feel satisfied with their lives. So you can see there's a huge gap just between the average and the devoted, right? And a big gap between those who are disengaged, right? But you're still talking about a 14% gap with the other 2 categories. So religion seems like it's kind of good for you in lots of ways, right? Feel like conditions of life are excellent on a personal level anyway. Satisfied with their personal life, way higher, 9 points. Have gotten the important things in life. I don't know what that means, but they seem to think they've gotten more of it. Life satisfaction, average scale, they're 1.4 above the average and way, almost 2 points higher than the disengaged. So on a personal well-being level, it seems that the religious are doing better again. Okay, so yeah, I mean, what Smith and Snell say, fairly obvious ways that the religiously devoted are different than other emerging adults. They appear, he says, or they say, to be adjusting better to emerging adulthood than their less religious peers. And I will say, this is my commentary. It's not clear how this helps us. We do certainly know that, this is really clear across social science, right? That religious people tend to be happier, they tend to have better relationships. They're happier with their sex lives once they're married. They're generally more, positive, and all of these things. This is really, really well established in pretty much all of the literature. And yet you can't make people believe things they don't believe, right? Like, you can't be like, well, you seem kind of sad and your life's going in a bad way. Have you ever considered religion, right? That's not something a doctor is ever going to say, because you either are religious or you aren't. And it's pretty difficult to, convince yourself of ideas that you don't inherently believe. It is interesting though, right? That, the most religious people do seem to be on this kind of better track. All right. Okay. This is probably our last big idea of the course. So this is Gen Z and religion. Okay. So, where does this come from? All right, let me tell you. So, all of this comes from a really recently founded institute. They were founded in 2019. And if you've taken sociology of youth with me, you'll have heard about them, because I talk about them. I have nothing but praise for these guys. They're really, really cool. They're called Springtide Research Institute, and they're specifically focused on young people, and specifically about religion and young people and the relationship and what it looks like. So they have been providing me with an invaluable service, basically since about 2020, of kind of cataloging what the landscape of religion and young people looks like. Okay, so what we see here, right? So this is their data from 2021, and I'll talk about a little. Actually, I can talk about their data here, because I just updated this slide with the data that came out in 2023. Although their Kindle version this time sucks and the graphs don't show up, so I couldn't screenshot it, so it looks like garbage. But whatever, no problem. All right, hang on. Let me go back one. One of the things we see, right, is that, this category here, Just Christian, is a pretty prominent category amongst young people. Okay. The majority of young people, right, so it's about 55% in this sample that are Christian, right? So this is a little bit different than, say, Pew's numbers, where they had, youth identifying as Christian as about 49. It's not totally out of bounds, but it's a little bit different, right? About 55% of young people consider themselves Christian. So we've got, our I guess if I throw in Orthodox, where's Orthodox? Black. So it's actually it's about 57. I forgot the Orthodox because I'm being mean. 57 say that they are Christian. The three big traditions are Just Christian. Now there's some debate about what this category means. I think Just Christian are our friends, the nons, right? Not the nuns. Don't get these two confused. The nons, right? Non-denominational people who are like unaware that they actually come out of a Protestant tradition, or that they've joined a Protestant tradition. They're like, I'm Just Christian. Some other people, have suggested that this is a sort of like prelude to an exit from Christianity altogether, right? When someone exits mainline evangelical or Protestantism or Catholicism, they might move into a space where they say they are Just Christian until they essentially like disengage completely. I think it's more likely this is the nons, right? Our non-denominational friends that I mentioned when we were talking about the religious landscape. Okay. And then we see, right, our atheists at 8%, our agnostics at 8%, our nothing in particular at 8%, and our agnostics at 8% as well, which basically gives us, 24%, which is kind of in range, right? 24% come on, pen. 24% non-religious, okay? Again, which is kind of roughly in range. And this is out of a sample of about 3,500. So it's a pretty good representative sample of American young people. And these are our young people 13 to 25 that they surveyed. That can't be good. Okay, fixed. It does work to hit things. Awesome. I don't know what's going on. Now there's a weird sound. Let's kill that. Thank you. Okay. All right. So what did this look like 2 years on? Not a whole lot of change, right? And we can kind of put things down to margin of error, right? So just Christian and Protestant here are roughly even. So basically, this has gone down 3%, and this is like Protestant has gone down or up 3%, just Christian went down 3%. So basically, I would say that that's basically just a minor identification question. Everything's within the margin of error, essentially, 2-3%. So there's not a big change, and we still have, where's my Orthodox? Yeah, so we basically still have 57% of young people identifying as some form of Christian. The biggest change between the two samples, I think, is probably this one. Nothing in particular, which was 8% here, is now 15%. And both atheist and agnostic are down 2%. Those are margin of error consistencies, right? Down 2% is within the margin of error for this particular survey. But this jump, of 7% is outside considerably the margin of error. So nothing in particular in this batch, because this is not longitudinal, this is just cross-sectional. So nothing in particular is definitely a bigger chunk right here, right? And we're talking now, if we're talking our non-religious, we're talking 28% in this sample, if I'm doing the math correctly. 15 plus 6, 21 plus 6. 27. My 27% of our young people are non-religious. So again, kind of within range, margin of error, nothing too surprising there. So over that 2-year period, the religious landscape for Gen Z kind of roughly even. Okay, so this is from the 2023 research, right? The majority of young people, say they are religious or spiritual or both. So basically, right, we have 68% of the young people in the sample overall saying they're at least slightly religious, and 78% saying they are slightly spiritual. Again, I would like you here to think of Rodney Stark, as I do every day, as I stand in front of my Rodney Stark shrine and bow. Oh, Saint Rodney of Stark, honey badger of the sociology of religion world, inspire me today to lecture to my students. It's my morning prayer. This would be a really, really strange kind of number if we're thinking of a kind of inherited model of secularization, right? Or even Bruce's kind of neo-inherited model, right? For 2/3 of your people, in that youngest cohort where they score the highest for nothing in particular, and atheist and agnostic, to say that they're spiritual. 78% say they're spiritual, 68% still say they are religious. Like if you were wanting to believe in the inherited model or even the revised inherited model of Steve Bruce, right? Because these still look like pretty spiritual and religious young people, right? They still seem to care about spiritual questions in major ways. Okay. Now that said, they look very differently at religion, right? 68% will say there are many religions they agree with, right? So they're pretty open, and you might hear that MTD, right? You might hear what Kenda Cressy-Dean is saying, right? That it's good for kind of removing some of those differences between people and helping people get along, right? With people of other religions. 58% of young people, say they don't feel connected to a specific religion. And 28, this one I think is really interesting. 28% of them, again, a weird one if you're wanting to believe Steve Bruce is like every generation is half as religious as the last. 28% of them, almost 30%, say they've become more religious or spiritual in the past few years. So again, weird numbers. Okay, sorry, this is ugly, but we'll get through it. This slide drives me insane. Okay. You keep using that word. I do not think that word means what you think it means. All right, so people who say they are religious. 28% of agnostics say they are religious, and 66% of them say that they are spiritual. Okay. A little odd, but not, it would be odd to say that they're religious, especially since agnosticism, at least in theory, is predicated on the idea that you don't have enough information to make a kind of decision, but okay, whatever. 11% of atheists say they are religious. And and 42% of them say that they are spiritual. Now, again, spirituality is much more broadly construed. Again, I'm a little confused because I'm like, shouldn't atheists believe that all you are is a meat bag flying through the universe? So what does being spiritual mean? I don't know. Whatever. Don't care. They confuse me. The rest of it is pretty, like, you'd expect. Buddhists, yes, they're religious and spiritual. So are Jews. So are Christians. So are Mormons. Muslims, wow, very religious. 94% say they're religious. Good job, Muslims. You've done a great job with your young people, keeping them saying they're very religious. That's awesome. 87% spiritual, nothing strange. Nothing in particular. They look a lot like the agnostics, right? 28% say they're religious, and yet they're nothing in particular. And 61% of them say they're spiritual. And the rest, right, is all kind of like what we would expect. Something else, I don't know what something else is, but it'd be like a grab bag of other religious traditions too. So that are too small to measure, right? Hindus, for example, would end up, and Sikhs would end up in something else in this sample. There's just not enough of them in the sample to class them as their own thing. But 88% of them say they're spiritual. And then people with 2 or more affiliations, likely parents of different religions, right? Still pretty reasonable numbers. All right. There we go. So they do not trust organized religion very much, right? If you took trusting religion as, these 2 categories, which I would say is fair, you're looking at 28% that say they trust religion completely, organized religion completely, or trust it a lot. The rest, are kind of suspicious of religion in general. So this is a very deinstitutionalized generation, right? And they don't trust organized religion in very many ways. They don't, religious service attendance is a bit of a grab bag. Not surprising, I think, with this generation, and considering their distrust in organized religion. 4 in 10 of them, basically 40, it's just sub 40%, say they never attend religious services. You can add to that, 27% that go 1 to 3 times a year. I don't love the way that question is asked, because if you should exclude weddings and funerals, but that doesn't appear to be what Springtide did. Whatever, they're not perfect. When they hire me, I'll fix it. No, I don't know. Once a month, right, about 10%. 2 to 3 times a month is 9%. So you can say like about a third, right? Not quite, not exactly. I mean, about a third is either, once a month or more, right? Only 4% go more than once a week, which is a lot, to be fair. And, only 13% go every week, right? So 17% are weekly attenders. So that's not, if you're a religious person, not a great number. If you add like 2 to 3 times a month, right, you're looking at 26%, so about a quarter. And 36% roughly at least once a month. So a little bit more than a third. So like in terms of like once a month or more, it's roughly even with never, right? With a lot in here. Okay, I'm sure you all love my random doodles. Okay, so what do they think about religion? Let's see if we can do this really quickly. Kind of modest, they're pretty suspicious of it in general, right? So, they'll 60% of them say, and this was you can answer multiple, or percentage of each young person who agreed with the statement, and So, don't believe some of the things they hear about talked in religious gatherings, 60%. This one's interesting. They don't like to be told, and we'll get to this next time when we talk about faith unbundled. They don't like to be told answers about faith. They'd rather discover answers on their own. Why do they not participate in religious communities? Because other things help them find meaning, right? 56% of them say they don't feel like they can be themselves, can be their full selves in religious communities. Over half of them say that. Religious communities try to fix their problems instead of just being there for them, right? This is like, every time my wife tells me something, she just wants me to listen. And I'm like, okay, here's what you need to do. And that's not what she wanted to hear. She just wanted me to listen. That's the same thing here, right? They want attentive ears from religious leaders, not a bunch of problem solving. They try to give them answers, but they're looking for something else. Religious communities are rigid, right, and restrictive, over half. Okay, I mean, you could read the rest of these, on your own. You have the slides, but you can kind of see, right? There's a lot of ways in which a lot of young people don't feel particularly comfortable in religious communities, right? And that's the reasons they don't turn to them in times of need, right? Do I have time for one more slide? Oh, I can't. Yeah. All right, I could do this. I feel like I'm running out of time. All right. Let's pick it up on the values gap on Wednesday. That will leave us with like 3 slides to do. I'll say something very briefly on Wednesday about the future of religion, which I can do very, very quickly. And then we'll wrap the course. So off to the races we go. We got 3 left here. I'll talk Faith Unbundled on Wednesday, and we'll be basically done. All right, we'll see you then. Hello. Of course. I mean, no. I hate that class.
I finished the major lab. I just wanted to run by the sample by you because it was like less straightforward.
Sure. Yeah, of course. Hang on. Let me just turn off the recording here. Stop.